In this video, we'll discuss fermentation, the process in which glucose is metabolized anaerobically, or in an environment that lacks oxygen. The term anaerobic describes an environment that lacks oxygen, whereas the term aerobic describes an environment rich in oxygen. In this video, we will discuss the two most common types of fermentation, lactic acid fermentation and alcoholic fermentation. Fermentation, both lactic acid and alcohol, begins with the same first step as aerobic respiration, glycolysis. Glycolysis is the process by which one glucose molecule, a 6-carbon compound, is transformed into two pyruvate molecules, a 3-carbon compound. If you look at the molecules below, the 6-carbon ring in glucose is visible, as well as the chain of 3 carbons in each pyruvate molecule. Now we'll look more into the details of the process. Glycolysis has 10 steps, the first 5 being energy investment, where 2 ATP are broken down into 2 ADP and 2 inorganic phosphate. The last 5 steps are the energy output phase, where 4 ATP are released and NAD+ is reduced to NADH. Glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm in both prokaryotes and eukaryotes. The products of glycolysis, NADH and ATP, are released into the cytoplasm of the cell. ATP remains in the cytoplasm as a molecule for energy storage that can be used for metabolic processes. In aerobic respiration, NADH transfers the electrons to the electron transport chain to create the proton gradient to form more ATP and oxidative phosphorylation, and oxygen accepts the electrons that traverse the electron transport chain. However, in fermentation, the electrons accepted by NAD+ to form NADH are not transferred to the ETC. In lactic acid and alcohol fermentation, the two pyruvates produced by glycolysis do not go through acetyl-CoA formation, the Krebs cycle, or oxidative phosphorylation. This is because fermentation is an anaerobic process, and there is no oxygen available to accept the electrons donated by NADH at the end of the electron transport chain. One anaerobic fermentation process is lactic acid fermentation. First, glycolysis occurs, and the net gain of 2 ATP is released into the cytoplasm. This is the only source of energy produced in the lactic acid fermentation. NAD+ is reduced to NADH. As pyruvate is transformed into lactate, the NADH molecule is oxidized to NAD+. The hydrogen ions given off are accepted by the lactate molecule. The pyruvate molecule has a methyl group, a carbonyl group, and a carboxyl group. The lactate molecule has the same methyl and carboxyl group, but 2 hydrogens are added to the central carbon. Bacteria in yogurt and red blood cells found within the immune system use lactic acid fermentation to break down glucose because they do not have the mitochondria to perform aerobic respiration. The membranes of the mitochondria and bound proteins are necessary to generate ATP through oxidative phosphorylation. Some yeast perform lactic acid fermentation, but most are associated with alcohol fermentation. The most widely known example of lactic acid fermentation is within the muscle cells. When you exercise, the body needs an excess amount of oxygen. If this oxygen is not available, then the anaerobic process of lactic acid fermentation occurs. Throughout exercising, lactic acid will build up within the muscle cells. Previously, scientists claimed that the buildup of lactic acid caused soreness within the muscles, or nausea and respiratory issues and joint pain. However, recent research has disputed the fact that lactic acid buildup causes muscle soreness. Another type of fermentation is called alcoholic fermentation. This process begins with glycolysis, which produces 2 ATPs and reduces NAD+ to NADH. Pyruvate molecules are then converted to 2 acetaldehyde molecules. If you look closely at the chemical structure of pyruvate, you will see a carboxyl group at the top of the molecule. The acetaldehyde molecule does not have this carboxyl group, only the methyl group and an oxygen and hydrogen covalently bonded to a carbon. This is because pyruvate releases CO2 when transforming into acetaldehyde. Next, acetaldehyde is transformed into ethanol, a type of alcohol. The hydrogen ions released from the oxidation of NADH to NAD+ are accepted by acetaldehyde to form ethanol. The central carbon of ethanol no longer has an oxygen double bonded to it, but 2 hydrogens and a hydroxyl group. Yeast are microorganisms that carry out alcohol fermentation most commonly. When baking bread, the dough rises as it is left to rest. This is because alcohol fermentation is occurring through the yeast in the bread. CO2 is being given off by the alcohol fermentation, and the byproduct ethanol is being produced. The bread rises because carbon dioxide is a gas in its standard state, and the gas is being trapped in the dough. Bread is not intoxicating because much of the alcohol produced evaporates off when baking, and it is not a long process of fermentation. In some cases, yeast have been domesticated to carry out alcohol fermentation even when oxygen is present in the environment. In wine, alcohol fermentation is carried out through the sugars from grapes or other fruits. These sugars enter glycolysis and then are transformed into acetaldehyde and eventually ethanol. Other alcoholic beverages, such as beer and vodka, carry out alcohol fermentation through the carbs and grain starches that are converted to glucose. Drinks have a certain alcohol content because ethanol is toxic to yeast as well as humans. Once the maximum threshold of ethanol has been produced, the yeast does not go through alcohol fermentation and produce more ethanol. The final process we will discuss is anaerobic cellular respiration. The key takeaway is that instead of using oxygen as the final acceptor of electrons after the ETC, other ions and molecules are used, and therefore water is not produced, but different substances. Prokaryotes in low-level oxygen environments carry out this process. To review, fermentation is an anaerobic process, which means that it lacks oxygen. Two types of fermentation are lactic acid, which is related to muscles and red blood cells, and alcohol, which is related to the yeast in wine and bread. Another process is anaerobic cellular respiration, which uses ions and other molecules as the final electron acceptor.